Hi, I'm Michelle Q, the artist of the cover art. I'm also currently a junior enrolled in AP Studio Art 2 at my high school. In this video, I will be explaining the inspiration for my piece entitled In the Time of Crisis, as well as the creation process, what the experience was like for me, and the specific images and meanings behind my artwork. The assignment, the prompt, and instructions. Around the time COVID-19 was just beginning to creep its way into the US, I was assigned a project for AP Art which involved me donning some kind of disguise. After sketching out the figure and an interesting environment with a black colored pencil, I was to add highlights with white gouache, which is essentially an opaque version of watercolor. Finally, color was to be added to the painting. My piece specifically utilizes colored pencils and is 12 inches by 18 inches. The idea and taking reference photos. As this project entailed wearing a disguise, what better to wear than a mask? I had several ideas. I considered portraying myself as an anxious young Chinese girl in the midst of the pandemic. I also considered pairing the face mask with a pair of medical gloves, a typical outfit perfect for a pandemic. The next step was taking the picture to use as a photo reference. I instantly thought of a stereotypical pose, dramatically putting a latex glove on. This led to a photo with a dramatic air fit for the current crisis that's full of confusion and anxiety. Thus, I ended up choosing the latter idea. My inspiration for the idea. The idea came to me rather quickly as the coronavirus issue besetting China was always on my mind. Having many relatives living in China naturally inspired me to bring attention to the crisis in the form of art. As my piece continued to evolve, so did the US as the virus continued to spread throughout the country. Thus, as my town went into quarantine, and as never-ending updates on collapsing businesses, stock market crashes, packed hospitals, etc. overwhelmed the news, my message gradually shifted. I depicted these drastic effects in the background of my piece, recording the events just as the news did. The process of creating the piece. Step 1. Creating 3 concept sketches. I first created 3 concept sketches that basically listed out 3 possible final layouts. The concept sketches were also supposed to show the person with additional elements in front of and behind the figure, which I did not determine until later on. Step 2. Suddenly with the final layout. I had originally chosen the first concept sketch, which was simply the photo drawn onto Chinese newspaper that discussed the status of coronavirus in Wuhan at that time. However, using newspaper as a canvas ended up failing. Thus, I redrew the figure onto the appropriate type of paper and prepared the final layout. To ensure a more accurate drawing, I used Photoshop and merged all of my photos together into one photo reference. Finally, I added grid lines to it so that it would be easier transferring the finalized layout onto the large paper I would be using for my final piece. The final photo reference included the hospital I volunteer at, the cutout photo of me, and the large face mask that represents caution tape obscuring part of the piece. Step 3. Sketching the final drawing. First, I used a black colored pencil to lightly sketch the outline of the figure according to the Photoshop layout. Then I blocked in the shapes of the shadows, though the photo shows only my head blocked in. This was all very hastily done because I had actually only started sketching on the final paper at school before my art period on the day it was due. At home, I improved the shapes of my sketch and added more definition to the shapes of the shadows. Before I proceeded with the shading, I erased all the grid lines. Where I shaded with the black colored pencil indicated the darkest shadows while the gray of the paper indicated the midtones. The highlights were added using white gouache, a thick watercolor-like paint, which I diluted with a tiny bit of water. The next portion of the project involved adding color to the painting. This too required 3 concept sketches called color studies. For the first color study, everything is colored with various shades of red as if the photo reference had a red filter over it, emphasizing the chaos and negative impacts the most. For the second color study, the black and white of the original painting is maintained except for the medical masks and the gloves that are color blue. The third color study, which I ended up choosing, is a combination of both. I felt that the contrast of the blues and reds created a more powerful meaning. Step 4. Changing the background. In the middle of coloring my piece, I decided to alter my background because I felt like having a simple hospital scene as the background was not compelling enough. This marked a significant change in the overall idea of my piece. As introduced earlier, I was further inspired by the effects of the virus once it reached my own country. Thus, I further felt the desire to display the harmful impacts the virus had on the US, hence the depiction of the stock market crash of the dough and the Chinese restaurant that's out of business. I felt it necessary to subtly mention the disastrous impacts the suspicion of and discrimination had against the Chinese during this time. Step 5. Adding color. I used Prismacolor color pencils over the white gouache and erasable black color pencil. I first chose one red colored pencil to lightly shade in the most prominently red areas. Then I proceeded with using multiple shades of red appropriate for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. As a finishing touch, I used a red fine liner in certain areas like the stock market K-line and the text to make them look more bold and crisp. Moving on to the blue sections, I used light blue shades for the masks. I also used blue-green colors like aquamarine and peacock blue to give depth. Lastly, I used crimson red watercolor and a little bit of watered-down gouache to paint the background. Also note the transparency of the glove on my left hand where I put it with my finger. I made sure that the red of my wrist was visible even through the blue glove. After I finished all the coloring, I came back in with a bit of white gouache to clarify the highlights. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed embarking on this journey with me.